Some weeks, some months, you're clearly very busy doing other things. Yeah. Some months you'll see something different to say. But
So good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Magdalen for everybody who is visiting us today. Today is, of course, the 25th of October, which is a very important date for this college. It's the date on which the president and fellows of Magdalen were restored to their offices in 1688 after they'd been expelled by King James II the preceding year for refusing to accept his candidate as president, who he was trying to impose on the college in a clear violation of their statutes and on the basis of an overweening abuse of executive power. The outcry which surrounded the expulsion of the Magdalen Fellows was one of the key events that led to King James himself being expelled from the country and the Glorious Revolution. So this is a date on which we remember the triumph of the college's constitution, its autonomy and independence, and its triumph over an excessive and overweening abuse of power by the state. And obviously we perform this important commemorative function by eating an enormous dinner. But before we do that, we have the Waynflete Lecture. The Waynflete Lecture is the premier lecture in the college's calendar, named in honour of our founder, William of Waynflete, the Bishop of Winchester. The lecture itself is, in fact, a constitutional requirement contained in the college's statutes. We are obliged to hold this lecture every year. So for all these reasons, this is a particularly appropriate event at which to welcome our speaker this evening, Lord Finkelstein. Danny Finkelstein is a politician, a thinker, a writer and a journalist whose long and distinguished career has been devoted to the championing of a politics of moderation based on respect for the rule of law and an appropriate reticence in the exercise of state power. I was delighted to read his column a few days ago, arguing for the importance of the United Kingdom remaining a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. Danny's been the executive editor of The Times, where he writes an unmissable weekly column, chair of the think tank The Policy Exchange, vice president of the Jewish Leadership Council, an advisor to William Hague when he was leader of the Conservative Party, and now co-host of a weekly podcast, How to Win an Election, with, amongst others, Peter Mandelson. And he sits in the House of Lords as a Conservative peer. This means Danny has inside knowledge of at least two of the front-running candidates for the current election of the next Chancellor of Oxford University. So I will be vigorously pumping him for information later. In 2023, Danny wrote a brilliant and moving family memoir, Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, about the experiences of his parents, who were both refugees from totalitarianism, one from Nazism and the other from communism. Tonight, he will be speaking on the topic Lessons from My Parents and asking the uncomfortable question whether what happened to them could happen again. We are delighted and honoured to have you here with us tonight, Lord Finkelstein, and let me invite everybody to give you a very warm welcome. Thank you. And there will be an opportunity for questions at the end.
Well, thank you so much. You made me sound amazing. I can't wait to hear myself speak. Before I begin, allow me to thank you for the privilege of addressing you this evening. The Restoration at Magdalen celebrates three things which are of great importance to my family. First, it celebrates the resistance of arbitrary power, a resistance conducted with great dignity, bravery and firmness of purpose, a resistance crowned with success. Second, it celebrates and asserts the independence of universities, something that is crucial to the development of knowledge and therefore the progress of mankind. And I'm the son of a university professor and the brother of a university president, and have been brought up with something like reverence for academic freedom. And thirdly, Restoration is a celebration of a truly great institution of learning. Magdalen was the academic home of one of my bosses, one of my best friends, and one of my sons. and each of them in turn loved it and still loves it. So as I say, it is my privilege to join you this evening. About 4 years ago, I wrote the first words of what became Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, a history of my family's experiences in the Second World War. And with all the research completed, I had to choose where to start the narrative. I picked the autumn of 2012, when I held my 50th birthday party. I told readers of the guests we had that day, how some of them were friends from work and some of them were relatives, but how most of the gathered crowd were the community of friends that my wife Nikki and I have known since we were in school. A group living happy, stable, safe, reasonably prosperous lives in the suburbs, and mostly Jews, many of us members of families who'd been here for no more than 2 generations. I thought this gathering the perfect audience for what I wanted to say. We cut the cake, I said thank you to everyone, and then I added this. I'm grateful for one other thing. By the time they were my age, my parents and my grandparents had lost everything they had, their country, their home, their property. They'd been forced to start again in a foreign land and a foreign language. We live here in peace, and we don't stay up at night fearing we will be woken by a knock on the door. We don't fear our children will be sent to fight in a faraway war. We don't feel arrest or exile. So here's to the Sunrise Cafe in North Harrow and the Tube Station and Brent Cross Shopping Centre and the local dry cleaners. Here's to all of us who love this country and its small ideas and don't want it swept away in a fit of popular enthusiasm or revolutionary zeal. Here's to the places that took in my family and yours. Here's to the suburbs and all of you who live in them. And after I'd recalled this moment, I paused in the book and I told the reader that I didn't think that if I was having this birthday party now, I'd make the same speech. Here's how I put it. The idea that the value of liberal democracy and law and liberty and tolerance is a lesson that has been learned and can't be unlearned seems hopelessly over-optimistic. What happened to my parents isn't about to happen to me. It isn't about to happen to my children. But could it? It could. Absolutely it could. And there I left it and began to tell the story of Mum and Dad. Partly I left it because I thought the reader might become impatient and wish me to get on with relating all the extraordinary things that happened to them. And partly I left it because it seemed quite a gloomy reflection, and my parents were upbeat, optimistic people. My mother always used to say that one should not only see the holes in the Emmentaler. This optimism was important to the book and to understanding the life that they led, and I wanted to be careful not to undermine it before the book had got going. But now I do want to return to the thought that I left unfinished in the early pages of Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, because the question that I asked then seems even more urgent now. Could what happened to my parents happen to me or to my children? In April 1956, at a meeting of the B'nai B'rith Youth Organisation in Seymour Place in central London, my mother met my father. Miriam was 22 years old, Ludwig was 26, and between them they'd lived in 10 countries. My father, by then an engineer working for the National Coal Board, was living alone with his mother Lusha in a small house off the Hendon Way. The two of them had a smattering of friends, but almost no family. They'd spent some time on national assistance and Ludwig's university grant, but now Ludwig had a job and Lusha had an income from working round the clock in a language school in Golders Green. My grandfather Dolu had died. Tired, broke and broken, he'd lived his last years far from the place he'd once called home. His health, his wealth and his standing long gone. The Finkelsteins had once been a mighty family, numerous, wealthy, respected, leaders of the community. They had built a beautiful modern house on the hill in Lwów in eastern Poland, a symbol of their prosperity and self-confidence. Dolu's metal business had been so successful and he so well off that he was known as the Iron King. and he was a civic leader, a senior member of Lvov's city council. And then the Soviets came. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and shortly afterwards the Russians entered the country from the other side. The Poles briefly entertained the idea that the Soviets had come to save them. But soon the truth became obvious. The Soviets had come as occupiers too. The Soviets and the Nazis had agreed a non-aggression pact, and it contained an appendix so secret that the Russians denied its existence for decades. The appendix envisaged the division of Poland between the two dictatorships, and Lvov would be under the control of the Soviets. Immediately upon the surrender of the city of Lvov to its new conquerors, the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Soviet Ukraine moved into the city to supervise the takeover. He moved, in fact, into the house opposite the Finkelsteins and set to work. And this is how my father became the neighbour of Nikita Khrushchev, and how the whole family became Khrushchev's victim. The Secretary General arranged rigged elections, turned Polish Lvov into Soviet Ukraine Lviv, confiscated the Finkelstein home, forcibly nationalised the family business, wiped out everyone's savings, and then started to arrest all of the city's prominent citizens. In April 1940 came Dolu's turn. He was taken away by the secret police to sign some forms, and he never returned. He'd been transferred to the Brigitki prison, and soon began an ordeal of nightly interrogation, the burden of which was that he was guilty of strengthening the might of capitalist Poland, which, to be fair, is something he most certainly was guilty of. After months of this, and having been moved from one prison to another, Dolu was finally called forward to be told that without any form of trial or opportunity to answer charges, he had been found guilty of being a socially dangerous element, Article 54.13 of the Ukrainian Criminal Code. He was sentenced to 8 years of hard labour in the Gulag and sent to pull logs to the river as if he were a pack horse. The clear intention is that the labour would kill him, although he would make some money for the state before it did. When Dolu had disappeared, his wife Lusha had gone to ask after him at the prosecutor's office. She was informed that Dolu was just being questioned. If she returned after 4 days, she would be told where he was. After 3 days, there was a knock at the door, and she and my 10-year-old father were themselves arrested. Lusha and Ludwig would be sent thousands of miles to the borders of Kazakhstan and Siberia to be forced labourers on a collective farm. They too would help feed Stalin's cities and troops, while themselves freezing and starving. And eventually, as far as the Soviets were concerned, they would die from their exertions and the climate. What happened to the Finkelsteins happened to certainly hundreds of thousands of Poles, and probably to more than 1 million of them. It ended in death for many, and would surely have ended in death for my father if Hitler had not taken it upon himself to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa started on the 22nd of June 1941. It made Stalin into an enemy of Hitler, but it is crucial to understand that this was not Stalin's intention. He had, until this unexpected attack, quite happily been Hitler's ally. Partly this alliance was for convenience, to gain a tactical advantage, but it was also ideological. The two powers were joined in contempt for liberal democracy and so-called bourgeois capitalism. Both Nazis and communists believed that they understood and incarnated the spirit of the people, and that they were protecting this spirit from subversion by a secretive and dangerous elite. In the case of the communists, they claimed that the middle class, property owners, the bourgeoisie, was the dangerous elite. For the Nazis, the dangerous elite was the Jews. So the Soviets set about arresting all the shopkeepers, some of whom were Jews, and the Nazis arrested all the Jews, some of whom were shopkeepers. And just as my 10-year-old father was regarded by the Soviets as part of this subversive elite, so the Nazis felt the same about my 10-year-old mother. Miriam Wiener was born on the 10th of June 1933 in Berlin. Her parents were intellectuals, both with PhDs. Her mother an economist and her father a scholar of Islamic literature. Her parents were also Jews, and Alfred had become one of the leaders of German Jewry. One of the first people to spot the rise of Hitler and understand what it meant, Alfred had spent much of the 1920s warning of the rise of the far right. He addressed rallies and meetings, published articles, sued Nazis, and even sent some of them to jail. And he began a famous archive of everything the Nazis did or said, an archive that later aided the war effort and helped convict the Nuremberg defendants and Adolf Eichmann. Despite all of Alfred's warnings and all of his court cases, the Nazis had taken power in 1933, and shortly after they did, Alfred was called for a meeting with Hermann Goering. The Nazis knew of his archive, Goering told my grandfather, and Alfred would have to destroy it. It was time to leave Germany. And by the time my mother was born, Alfred had gone ahead to the Netherlands, where the family would now locate. Moving to Holland in 1933 did not require a visa, and the country seemed a safe choice because it was neutral and had a viable Jewish community. Otto Frank, who became Alfred's friend, moved his family there from Frankfurt too. But as things turned out, Holland was not to prove safe. Few people knew more about who the Nazis were and what they might do than my grandparents, Alfred and Greta. They may have known more than Hitler himself did about what fascism might mean for the Jews, but this knowledge still didn't save them. Alfred had reopened his archive in Amsterdam in 1933, but in 1938 he realised he'd have to move again. The Dutch government worried about its impact on their neutrality, and it began to make a nuisance of itself. So Alfred moved to London and took his library with him. But his wife and daughters stayed in Holland, where they were settled and felt secure, and this proved an error. When an aggressive dictatorship takes control of a major power, it may not be enough to understand its nature and try to escape. Even assuming you can find somewhere to take you in, you may not select the right place, because aggressive dictatorships are rarely content with the territory they govern. They wish to dominate their neighbours too. The Wieners had fled from Germany to Holland. They had fled in the earliest days of Nazi rule, but they'd not fled far enough. So in 1940, what happened to Dolu, Lusha and Ludwig happened to the Wieners. They found themselves at the mercy of a conquering power. And eventually they lost their citizenship, their home, their property and their liberty. My mother was to go first to Westerbork, a Dutch transit camp, and then to Belsen. She only escaped death due to a rare prisoner exchange, but the escape was a narrow one, and not all of her family members were so lucky. What happened in these years of dictatorship and oppression left my paternal grandmother the only one alive among 7 siblings. It killed some of my closest relatives. It murdered their friends and their families and scattered the rest across the globe, isolated and in exile. It confiscated their homes and property, stealing every penny, every stick of furniture, every piece of cutlery. It took from them their citizenship and their livelihoods. That my mother and father survived at all is a miracle, and most people like them did not. So I ask, could what happened to my parents and grandparents happen to me or to my children? Let me start the answer to this question with what is undoubtedly a pretty sobering reflection, even if a relatively obvious one. People clearly have in them the capacity for terrible deeds and a willingness to obey authority, even if it instructs them to obey terrible deeds. In 1962, while still in his 20s, Stanley Milgram, the academic, conducted what was to become one of the most famous series of experiments in the history of social psychology. In a laboratory in New Haven, he gathered together ordinary people who were to help him to establish the impact of pain upon learning. Under supervision, they would administer electric shocks to subjects every time they made a mistake in a test. Would the subjects get better at learning? Except this isn't what Milgram was really testing. What he actually wanted to know was whether, when instructed, people would be willing to inflict serious pain, even a fatal shock. It was a test of the obedience of the participants. The subjects weren't the subjects, they were really actors, and the shock machine a fake. What Milgram found was that 65% of participants just kept on shocking. Under prompts from an instructor, they flicked the switch marked intense shock, then the one marked extreme intensity shock, and onto the one labelled danger severe shock, and finally they flicked the last two marked just 450 volts XXX. They did this even though through the window of the lab they could see the subject screaming and eventually playing dead. The result was shattering, not least for Milgram himself. He wrote that he had once believed that it would be impossible in the whole of the United States to find enough moral imbeciles to man the death camps of Nazi Germany. I am now beginning, he said, to think that the full complement could be found in New Haven. More concerning still is that the willingness to obey orders and this belief in authority is not a mere quirk that Milgram only exposed by tricking people. For a disturbingly high proportion of people, it is an explicit part of their politics. Britain has a long democratic tradition, longer than almost anywhere on earth, and polling suggests it is more tolerant and liberal than almost anywhere else on earth too. Yet when Onward, the think tank of which I'm chairman, commissioned some research on attitudes to democracy in the autumn of 2022, I found the results alarming. Support for running the UK with, quote, a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament/elections, end quote, was at 46%. And among voters between the ages of 18 and 34, it was 61%. 44% of this last group said that they supported rule by the military. Almost as alarming were findings by the polling group More in Common on attitudes towards COVID restrictions. In December 2023, that is just a few months ago, when it was impossible any longer to regard COVID as posing an outside risk to the population, 28% of millennials said that they believed people should still only be allowed to leave their homes for essential shopping and 60 minutes of exercise. 29% believed that the population should only be allowed to meet outdoors in groups of 6. 33% wanted to close all nightclubs. The proportion fell a bit for older groups, but was still above 20% for almost all the groups. What this at least suggests is that many people show a preference for security over liberty that is really quite extreme. There is an alternative explanation, of course, though I'm not sure it makes things much better. People don't think a great deal about political issues. So when they're asked a question by a pollster on a policy matter, their answer may not be very well thought through. When I worked for the Conservative Party in 1997, we discovered that the Liberal Democrat policy of putting a penny on tax to pay for education was extremely popular. But not a penny in the pound, just a penny. They didn't realise that's what the Liberal Democrats had meant. These disturbing polls may not therefore show definitively that a large proportion of the population really believe in military rule and want to confine people to their homes just to be on the safe side. But they certainly do show a remarkable insouciance about such things. And it may be that ignorance and apathy can do much of the work that would otherwise have to be done by an active commitment to authoritarianism. There's one other human tendency worth mentioning alongside these others, a tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. We are storytelling machines and we make sense of events by turning them into narratives. We prefer an implausible narrative to the absence of any story at all. Theories about the nefarious activities of the World Economic Forum, or the idea that the cost of living crisis is created by governments to control populations, are supported by roughly 1 in 3 people. When in the 1920s my grandfather Alfred Weiner first began his campaign against the far right, he accorded a prominent role in the rise of Jew hatred to belief in conspiracies. And the most recent research indicates that belief in one or more popular conspiracy theory is highly correlated to anti-Semitism. So, a large proportion of the public, even in Britain, is sceptical about democracy, open to military rule, careless about liberty, insouciant about politics, and susceptible to believing in conspiracy theories. I'm asking the question, could what happened to my parents and grandparents happen to me or to my children? Maybe what I should be asking is, why is it not already? Here are the 3 central contentions of my lecture. First, the reason why what happened to my parents has not happened to me and my children is because we've been protected by the institutions and consensus of the post-war era. Second, the post-war era is fading and its consensus is fraying, and we are now living in the post-war era. This is inevitable and produces some advantages, but it also represents a real threat. And thirdly, we can still repair any damage. Let me expand upon these. When the war came to an end in 1945, my grandfather Alfred found it almost, though not quite, impossible to find the funds to keep together his collection of documents about the Nazis. As his friend, the Labour MP James Callaghan, told him with great regret, few people were now interested in documenting the far right and nationalist movements. Political concern about such things had faded. Callaghan suggested Alfred instead seek funds from trade unions to research German industrial policy. This was appropriately realistic about the library, and it barely survived, though it eventually did, with Callaghan himself prominent among the saviours. But fortunately, it was too pessimistic about the broader political environment. In those early post-war years, there were great statesmen and thinkers who were very concerned with erecting institutional and political barriers to a repetition of what had happened, erecting barriers to the rise of the Nazis and other anti-democratic forces. The most important result of all this was the Truman Doctrine. For the United States of America to take an interest in what happened much beyond its borders was, in 1945, a pretty recent phenomenon. When Theodore Roosevelt had visited Panama in 1906 to check on the progress of the building of the Panama Canal, he had been the first president to travel abroad while in office. His distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, became president 26 years later as the commander-in-chief of a country still averse to entanglements in the affairs of others. When my grandfather had arrived in New York in 1940, he had conducted research on American attitudes to the war in which Britain was embroiled. Alfred found there was no appetite whatsoever for the Americans to become involved, and this did not easily change. Eventually, however, attack by Japan and a declaration of war by Hitler did alter the position. Yet there was every chance that when the conflict was over and American boys returned home, they would wish to stay home. Further involvement in Europe did not seem very attractive at all, and there was much resistance among voters and in Congress. Harry Truman, a machine politician, farmer, and owner of a small, failed shirt retail outlet, seemed a most unlikely person to leap these political hurdles. For most of his life, the idea that he would change the history of mankind would have seemed utterly ludicrous. But in 1945, FDR died suddenly, and Truman, who had risen quietly to become his vice president, inherited Roosevelt's office and his great responsibilities. Within months, the war was over, and Truman, supported by his main advisors, decided upon a policy of engagement rather than isolation. There were several planks to this policy, and each was critical to the politics of the post-war era. In 1947, Truman announced to Congress that his foreign policy would be to support democratic nations threatened by authoritarian forces. His commitment was both financial and military. It led to US involvement in the Korean War and also to the creation of the Marshall Plan, a financial effort to save Europe from economic collapse and improve material conditions. The explicit understanding of General George Marshall and of the other Truman administration officials who developed the Marshall Plan was that the success of economies was crucial in protecting countries from authoritarianism. In other words, capitalism had to succeed if liberal democracies were to thrive. And the best protection against recurrence of authoritarianism in Western Europe has indeed been the stunning economic success of market economies. People have a practical, not a theoretical approach to democracies and support them only as they deliver. For decades, democracies have done just that. Part of the motivation of Truman's administration was to prevent a repetition of the Nazi Holocaust. But a bigger part of it was to contain the ambitions of the Soviets. The United States, sometimes wrongly and sometimes rightly, saw right-wing nationalist authoritarian regimes as temporary and changeable, but they saw communism, once it had taken hold, as much more difficult to overcome. So a core part of the post-war era became the clash between capitalism and communism, and it became the accepted and undeniably correct wisdom in Western Europe that the former was more successful than the latter. The flaws of communism, its economic shortcomings and its oppressive nature, became the widely accepted political consensus in Western Europe, and certainly in Britain, with only a fringe dissenting. When I was 14 years old, I wrote to Harold Wilson, the retiring Labour Prime Minister, with some questions for the Scout magazine I edited, and I got back a letter from his political secretary, Marcia Williams. I learned that Wilson liked the Muppets and Huddersfield Town, and he was proud of having been a Scout. Then when I asked him which newspapers he read, he answered all of them, except the Morning Star, showing how far the Communist Party and its newspapers were outside the political mainstream. Crucial to the Truman Doctrine, of course, was nuclear deterrence, and this was tied to another part of the post-war Western consensus, the Munich analogy. Whether or not it is historically accurate or fair, most mainstream democratic politicians after the war subscribed to the idea that Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain in 1938, had made a terrible mistake in that year. At the Munich conference, he had agreed a deal with the Nazis. He had carelessly thought Czechoslovakia a small, irrelevant country of which we know little. He had then underestimated its importance and completely misunderstood Hitler. The agreement had only encouraged Hitler to believe we would stand by and do nothing to prevent his aggression. The lesson of Munich seemed to be that it is foolish to give an inch to dictators, as they will take a mile. After 1945, Western politicians frequently saw international disputes as involving another Hitler, and treated suggestions of retreat or concession as being analogous to proposing another Munich. One only has to listen to the speeches of Anthony Eden during Suez or Margaret Thatcher during the Falklands War to see the long shadow that Munich cast. Munich was only one of the mistakes that had helped shape the post-war era. Another was the failure to realise until it was far too late the plight of the Jews. Reading official papers while working on Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, I was struck by how late in the war it was before the US State Department and the British government began to appreciate, and even then only fitfully and with little imagination, what was happening to Jews. It was seriously suggested in these documents that much of the fuss being made by the Jews was in fact itself a plot by Hitler. Hitler wanted, diplomats feared, to flood the Allied countries with refugees, some of them spies, and force shipping to be diverted to a rescue mission. When, after the liberation of Belsen in particular, the truth of what had happened began to dawn, it had its impact on post-war debate. although it did not immediately convert the leadership of the West to accepting the idea of a Jewish state, eventually the foundation and recognition of Israel became hard to resist. Apart from anything else, there didn't seem to be anywhere else for many Jewish refugees to go. That certainly helped to convert my grandparents, none of whom had been Zionists before the war. Indeed, Alfred had written a popular book on the subject, opposing the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Support for a Jewish state became part of the mainstream political settlement, with support on the centre-left being particularly strong. And all of this was underpinned by an emerging international order. Alongside its engagement in the Cold War, the United States gave its support to the creation of international institutions in a way that its legislators has simply refused to countenance when President Woodrow Wilson had proposed such arrangements after the First World War. Within a few years, the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund had all been created. The UN Refugee Convention had been agreed to, as was the European Convention of Human Rights. The US also encouraged the formation of the European Economic Community and agreed the North Atlantic Treaty and the foundation of NATO. At the Nuremberg trials, the prosecutors established the ideas of crimes against humanity, and genocide began its journey to become a recognised term and a recognised crime. These were important steps towards the foundation of an international legal system, admittedly still imperfect and partial, where it was no longer acceptable for a governing power simply to argue that its murders and thefts were no one's business except their own. This, then, was the politics of the post-war period. The Truman Doctrine, capitalist growth, the Cold War consensus about communism, the application of the Munich analogy, the foundation of an international legal order, the creation of the State of Israel, and a consensus that it was right to create it. All these things, institutions and views, help to keep in check the natural tendency to support strongman dictatorships, illiberal politics, and conspiracy theories. The post-war settlement was designed to stop what happened to my parents happening to me and to my children, and it worked. But now, while it is too strong to say that it is crumbling, the settlement is certainly under much greater pressure. One reason is simply the passage of time. Someone who was old enough to vote when Hitler and Stalin signed their pact would now be 104 years old. The young people who say that they would favour military rule did not experience its consequences directly, nor did they join armies and fight against it. Millions of British citizens were not even born when the Cold War came to an end, and the failure of communism is history to them. And for these people, capitalism doesn't appear to be the recurring miracle that it once did. Growth is stuttering. Young people in particular find it harder to secure a well-paying job and buy a home. New technologies promise much, but they also threaten increased inequality and make some skills redundant. People are looking for someone to blame. Another reason why the post-war consensus in Europe is under pressure is mass immigration. Millions of British and European citizens were not born in Europe, or their parents weren't, so naturally they see the world order differently and have different priorities. The historical fate of Europe's Jews makes less impact upon them, and they feel less or no responsibility for it. Atlanticism has little appeal to them. They see the Cold War differently. And on top of this, over time, many bloody and unsuccessful military engagements have made the Munich analogy less compelling and the wisdom of resisting dictators less obvious. We are living in the post-war era, and it is quite different. You can see the signs of it everywhere. The next fortnight could see the return to office of Donald Trump, someone who openly shares the admiration for strongman dictatorships and himself employs their language and threats. Many of his political allies are keen to withdraw assistance from Ukraine, the place which has shown most clearly that the Munich analogy still has value. All over Europe, In Italy, Hungary, Poland, Germany, Austria, even in Britain, populists are enjoying political success. They advance the idea, familiar to the people who took my parents as prisoners, that there is a national spirit and that it is being undermined by secretive and cunning elites. They promote conspiracy theories using new media but ancient arguments. They are leading the case that the international legal order is the rule of foreign courts over sovereign people. There is serious talk in this country of leaving the European Convention of Human Rights. And all over the world, people who once daubed on the walls of Europe, Jews go to Palestine, are now daubing Jews get out of Palestine. The rise in anti-Semitism is obvious and alarming. This was the reason, this new post-war era, that I would not now make again the speech I made at my 50th birthday party. Could what happened to my parents and grandparents happen to me or to my children? It could. But we're not going to let it. We can't let it. We're going to show that capitalism works and make sure it works for everyone. In particular, we're going to make it work for young people who need a home to own and a job to enjoy. Once more, young people will see that they're better off than their parents. In this way, we'll make military rule and strong men feel unnecessary. And we will defeat the argument for a communism that doesn't work and has never worked. We're going to maintain a powerful Western alliance, hopefully with the United States, but if necessary, without them. We're going to take up the arguments for the most controversial causes, insisting on the need for Israel to exist and be safe, resisting dictators and taking their threats seriously. We're going to carry on the fight against Vladimir Putin, be realistic about the ambitions and power of China, and stand up to the Iranian regime. And we are going to defend and develop the international legal order and demand that our politicians do the same. I believe these battles are winnable. I think they will be won. I'm a realist, but I'm not a pessimist. My parents came to this country and they felt safe here. They taught it the very best of places. We're all going to make sure it stays that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we come and sit down and then we can
Sure.
take some questions. Brilliant. Thank you. But before we have the first question, I just want to ask you something. I mean, listening to your analysis domestically, your adult life has been spent in the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a Conservative leadership election happening at the moment where one of the two candidates is strongly committed to withdraw from the European Human Rights Convention and is saying no one will be able to serve on their front bench without committing to it, and where a lot of the rhetoric seems to fall into exactly the same kind of populist, pro-strongman ideas that you've been attacking. Do you feel you still have a home in that party?
Depends a little bit on the outcome. I certainly regard that as a completely unacceptable position. I noted that my friend George Osborne, and I think also was at Magdalen, has said you couldn't vote Conservative in those circumstances. Well, I completely see why. I actually don't think Robert Jenrick will win, and interestingly enough, I think one of the reasons he won't win is because there's still a majority of people in the Conservative Party who think that position goes too far, and I can't say that even that's a satisfactory approach to it, but it's certainly better than his. I characterise his election campaign as having been to type into ChatGPT the words "How do I win the leadership of the Conservative Party?" and then read out the answer. So I'm not even sure I think it's an authentic position, but I certainly think it's alarming, and I can't understand why it's proven so difficult to explain to Conservatives. So on the eve of the election in which Jeremy Corbyn was going to fight in 2017, where he did deprive Theresa May of her majority, and in those circumstances, who would have coalesced with the Conservatives if not the Ulster Unionists? So it's conceivable in those circumstances that Labour under Corbyn would actually have taken control of power. Even at that point, the Conservative Party did not seem to understand the point of a legal order which would protect the rights of property, for example. And I found that extraordinary. Yes, I'm very concerned about it.
I just want to ask you one more question. You've obviously referred to the creation of the State of Israel and the importance of protecting Israel as part of the post-war consensus. But is it possible really to look at the current hostility to the State of Israel without recognizing the actions of one of the most notorious strongmen in the region and the appalling devastation that has been inflicted there?
I unquestionably think that Benjamin Netanyahu is a populist of the Trump kind, and has been quite dangerous to Israel's security and to its constitution. There obviously what's happening in Gaza is more complicated than that, but it does make, I think, lots of people who feel that the ending of the State of Israel would be an existential threat for Jews, and who note that half the Jews of the world live there, are made very uncomfortable by the fact that the military action is led by someone in whom we can't have any trust. That's a very disturbing position. So you're pulled between a feeling that he's unquestionably himself, a politically dangerous individual, and the feeling that you could not possibly leave Israel to be eradicated by its next door neighbour. So you get pulled in both directions.
I want to open it up now. People, yes, at the back. Yeah, there is a mic coming.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and the book is wonderful. When you were talking about the reasons why the post-war order is coming under pressure, I don't think that you mentioned the internet. And yet, in all sorts of ways, that seems like a game changer in terms of how we understand the world, how politics is held to account, and setting a pace for politics that traditional institutions struggle to match. So I wondered, how optimistic do you feel about the capacity of the kind of politics that you represent, of moderation and of institutional caution, to survive the age of the internet?
Yeah, so I didn't include it for a reason that I think does chime with my sort of attempt at moderation, which is I wasn't sure. So I think there's lots about the internet that are actually an extraordinary tool of knowledge that puts on everyone's desk, an incredible. It meant that I could work out what on earth the restoration dinner was. At great length, I even looked at your bill for coffee, and in the time of James the Second. So you've got this incredible store of knowledge. It's absolutely extraordinary, and I think actually everyone's got the capacity to learn more, but also obviously it speeds up the spreading of falsehood as well. And so because I was so torn by it, I decided I wouldn't enter into a sort of long description. I think it both has the capacity to reinforce the forces of kind of liberal democracy, but clearly it also can undermine it too. And I sort of daily fluctuate between optimism and pessimism about it.
Yes, at the back on this side. Sorry, I'm making the roving mic run long distances.
Thanks. That was great. And so this is kind of a follow up from some of what Dino asked, but you ended the lecture with a stirring call that we will save liberal democracy. And I guess I just wondered who you thought the we was there. So it could be the people in this room, but there's not that many of us. In response to Dino, it evidently isn't Robert Jenrick or Benjamin Netanyahu. It's obviously not Trump. So I guess I'm wondering who the we is. It could be ordinary people, but I guess some of what you said makes it cast some doubt on that as well. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about, where your optimism / realistic optimism comes from.
So I suppose it's an appeal to a kind of broad swathe of liberal Britain to which I anticipated this audience would belong. And by the way, some of the one of the reasons why the enemies of kind of liberal democracy aim so much scorn at metropolitan elites and educated people and young people is that they perceive that too. They can see that that is where the resistance to these big and dangerous ideas might come from. So it was a speech designed to be delivered in universities, celebrating the independence of their institutions and those who might be attracted to come to such an event, because if we the people who are covered by that don't come to the defense of liberal democracy, sure as hell nobody else is going to do that. So that's who I was referring to. I think there's a broad centre in British politics, some of which is reflected in Parliament. You know, there still remains that in the Conservative Party. You know, our local MP, for example, and where I live in Ruislip, Pinner and Northwood, is from that tradition. So there are still people who belong in that tradition, and there certainly are people in the government. I've said a lot that I don't want this government to fail, because if it does, I think it takes down with it the idea that mainstream, well-ordered government can succeed in delivering the things that I talked about. So I certainly would include, you know, the Prime Minister and his leadership in the group of people I mean by we, because I think he does associate himself with these ideas. But you know, that even despite the fact that I've got some questions over the policies that he might implement.
Yes, in the middle.
Thank you for such a thoughtful lecture. You made a clarion call for the success of capitalism. Do you think capitalism might have to be modified? Can growth go on forever? Or can we think of a capitalist model that will be dynamic, have a lot of activity, but not necessarily subjugated to growth?
Yeah. So look, I think and I didn't cover this in my lecture, but it was touched upon actually by the question about the internet. We're about to go through this incredible period of technological growth and technological change with AI and biological technology, biotechnologies, and also quantum computing was going to change the economy very profoundly, and it's an opportunity because it will lead us to be able to improve lots of things. For example, the health service. It'll enable us to solve the problem that we're having at the moment, which is, you know, how does a country that's got a very big deficit problem, doesn't want to pay more tax, is already at the limit of taxing and spending, improve its public services? And one of the ways is by a revolution in productivity and technology. So we've got this great opportunity, but the problem with it also is that it's quite possible the wealth and power, that it'll concentrate the wealth and the power only in the hands of those people who own it, and that it will make a lot of people's work redundant. I did touch on that very slightly, and we're going to have to deal with that as well. So I'm far from being a libertarian and a free market libertarian. I think that capitalism depends upon rules of law, regulations, and actually for its political consensus, a welfare state. And certainly we're going to have to amend and develop those things, but they're what I regard as part of the capitalist system. So I would, for example, describe Sweden as a capitalist country as well as Britain.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Lord Finkelstein. It was riveting, and particularly moving, listening to it just yards away from the medieval Jewish cemetery in Oxford, to which Magdalen was home for some years. And no one in 1290, when all the Jews were expelled from England, could have imagined that we would be hearing a lecture like this in this place. It was very special. And my question derives from this and from what you were saying a few moments ago in your expert analysis of Netanyahu, but also your simple summary of Gaza as complicated. And you'll be aware that recent terms in Oxford and other places have been characterized by the encampments, and an indication that those who were in the encampments seemed not to understand how complicated it is. You've come to a university for reasons that you explained so clearly as really one of the places where there is hope for the future. Is that hope really justified? Or is there a fear that it's over-optimistic, given the level of ignorance, even in a university like Oxford, about this complicated situation?
No, well, occasionally it is a subject of despair. I mean, when you're in politics, you're used to people talking very confidently about things they have little knowledge of, but nevertheless, you're also used to trying to listen to what people are saying and seeing whether you can pull something out of it. So the approach I took, and I was on BBC Question Time, somebody asked me, a young person asked me a passionate question about Gaza, and I said, which I honestly think is true, we could both sit there reading out our talking points, the terrible things that have happened in Gaza, the appalling loss of life, the numbers of children that are being killed, the question about the justice of the Palestinian cause, whether you can go back and forward on the subjects of the occupation and why it's happening and why it's not been reduced. And I can then make my talking points about the need for the existence of Israel, and we're in the meantime getting absolutely nowhere. So what I propose to people is that we both sit there and try to establish the points that we think we've heard from the other person that have some power. Clearly, the creation of the State of Israel was something that the people who lived in Palestine already, who's had a nascent aspiration to a state of their own, in many cases, though not all, for them, the fact that this was going to be created presented itself to them as something of a challenge, and to many people a disaster. And they then engaged in resistance to it, which I completely understand. And in the resistance to it, they fought a war, which we can all question about whether it was necessary. And we then got, as a result of that war, the creation of the Palestinian refugee crisis. You can then begin to engage in a discussion about all the policies that have taken place since then. The right approach is for people whose main concern is the creation, safety, and maintenance of the State of Israel, should spend all of their time thinking and talking about the justice of the Palestinian cause, and all the people who believe in the Palestinian cause should spend all their time talking about the security of Israel. I'm not getting very far in this effort. Right. I wrote an article in the Times in which I set out exactly this approach, and I have to confess to you, I did not receive a single reply, even though I did it twice, in which anybody made a single concession to the approach that I'd taken. That I do find depressing. However, as it's the only alternative, I'm going to keep plugging away.
Yes, right at the back on the right.
Thank you so much. So I've spent the last 30 years or so researching and teaching the crises which engulfed your grandparents' lives. And what strikes me every time I do it is how intractable those crises were, that there was very little that would have led to a more optimistic solution in Russia, East Central Europe, Germany, Italy, or indeed 1930s Spain, that all of them were heading for some awful crash. And by comparison, the sorts of crises which are engulfing Western Europe, the United States, even Britain today, seem trivial in terms not of the sentiments or the politics, but the resources and the alternative options. And I still find it puzzling that we've gone so far down the track that the American election is poised, and the things which are being said don't seem to matter to anybody. They've all been trivialized. And I suppose I wonder, is it that the language doesn't mean the same things as it did anymore at that time? I mean, the only thing I can take comfort from is that among all the postmodern fascists, very few people actually want to go and die for anything, which there was no shortage of people willing to die for things in those causes in the 1930s, or indeed on the communist side. So I just wondered, taking your long-term perspective, let's forget about the current immediate crises of today. I just wonder whether the parallel between the post-war crisis that we live in now and the pre-war ones is really the same.
So my mother's favourite joke was, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the theatre? Right? And the reason she liked that joke was because she regarded a sense of proportion as being absolutely crucial thing. And in fact, when my father died, I'd been watching Chelsea play Norwich, and I came back and my father had died in the intervening period. And my mother talked to me briefly about that, and then said, "What was the score?" Right? She had the ability to puncture things even in those circumstances. So she would definitely be in sympathy with your question. She would ask questions of my lecture about proportion, and I think they're reasonable questions. But what has shaken me is an understanding that underneath institutions and rules and laws that have prevented this crisis, there is this extraordinary human will to dominate, this willingness to obey, lead strongmen leaders in circumstances in which as a group you can dominate. The fear that this may just be an evolutionary instinct, and something that game theory reveals, people are frequently put in the position whereby such dominance is an advantageous response to the incentive structure. So I do think that it is proportionate to be at least worried in the way that I am. But you're right, we haven't got to that point yet. The interesting question, I'm sure this is one you come, is this famous is it Goodwin or Godwin's law? The idea that after any row on the internet, somebody cites Hitler within about 3 or 4 comments, and this is a good joke and leads people to get very offended at the idea that Hitler's being invoked in some ridiculous situation, and it's right to raise questions about proportionality. But I still think if you only are interested in proportionality, you may miss the other point, which is the structure of human relations and our nature does lead us, repeatedly throughout history into this violent situation. My friend Gordon Wasserman in the House of Lords, he'd been reading Simon Sharma's book on the history of the Jews, and he said to me, what struck me, Danny, was that every 150 pages, somebody tries to kill all the Jews. And he said, why on earth do we think that's come to an end? And that, I suppose, is my answer.
Yes, over there.
Hi, Lord Finkelstein. Thank you. You mentioned power and how it's wielded a few different times. So I guess my question is, you've been exposed to power. You worked for William Hague when he was leader of the opposition, but you also spent a lot of time with David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, specifically writing or helping him craft what I guess would become his memoir later on. And so that's actually the first time I came across your name, actually, when I read that for the first time. And having seen him and spoken to him and heard from him during that time, I guess how did it change your relationship with perception of how power is wielded both domestically, and given that in that memoir he mentioned about 50% of a prime minister's job is international, how that affected your relationship, I guess, with the wielding of power internationally?
Yeah, so it was a very interesting experience. Other people may have had a different impression of him, but I had a very high view of David Cameron from that experience. In other words, I thought he was very well motivated to improve the quality of lives, to help peace, to do the right thing. I found that quite compelling. Look, it was the reason why I agreed to what I was doing, by the way, so that people who don't know this, I had this idea when he became Prime Minister. I was reading a book by a man called Taylor Branch, who's the historian of the Civil Rights Movement, but also was Bill Clinton's roommate. And Taylor Branch started to go and interview Bill Clinton and tape what it said. And I happened to be reading this book when David became Prime Minister, and he was a friend of mine. And I suddenly thought, why don't I do the same thing? That would be totally fascinating. So I texted him, sort of, congratulations on becoming Prime Minister. I'm reading this book. Why don't we do that? And he texted me back, good idea, let's do it. So we did. And every month I went in and I had an iPad and I wrote all the things down that I'd seen publicly, and I asked him questions about them. It was totally fascinating. Just in parenthesis, because this was one of the most interesting things, he was extremely worried right from the beginning that he would lose the Brexit referendum, even though most people think he always thought he was going to win, but he didn't. So I recorded all of that. That was very interesting later. And just to give you another example, we had a fascinating discussion about Libya. And there were lots of people saying, do not go in to Libya when you don't know your way out, when you have no exit strategy. And ultimately, you can see that that was a justifiable concern. I put this to him at the time when he was making the decision. And he said to me, here's my problem. I haven't got a way out, and I'm not going to think of one in the next 24 hours. But what is going to happen in the next 24 hours is Gaddafi's going to kill all of those people. And I can stop that. And I just can't not do it. So it was totally fascinating. Probably the most important thing I learned was the prime ministers don't know how it's all going to transpire. They have to take the decisions as it's going along. They have to live with another example. There was a big fuss about Andrew Mitchell, the chief whip, and whether or not he'd called a police officer a pleb. Mm-hmm. It was a big scandal. And the bottom of it, David didn't know whether he had or not. He liked Andrew and thought if Andrew said he hadn't, he probably hadn't, but he didn't know. So there he was dealing with this massive thing where there was justice towards somebody that he knew. He didn't want to remove him unjustly when he hadn't done something. But there was also this fact that if he was just, he had to remove him, and he had that dilemma. So I think the thing that struck me most was how often you have to act as Prime Minister while things are going on. You're not in control of circumstances, and you just have to ride them because you don't know how the story's going to end, and you're in the middle of it.
Sobering. I want to ask you just one last question before we finish. Who's going to win the American election?
I really don't know. Look, any reasonable reading of the polling will demonstrate that even the result of the general election could be random fluctuation. It may not be a very good measure of public opinion even, because it's so close, right? So you literally can't say. I'm left with a bit of an instinct that repeatedly the populist candidates and causes tend to overperform their poll ratings, but that does not always happen. It did not happen. It didn't happen in, for example, Austria, and it did not happen in France. So there are occasions when they expect it to happen, it does not happen. France, particularly good example recently. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think we all have to be ready for the fact that Donald Trump might win. And we also need to try to think to ourselves why that is. What is in what ways can we strengthen liberal moderate views to appeal to a portion of people whom Donald Trump is clearly taken from the Democrats?
Thank you very much. It's been quite a heavy evening, in the sense that not that the talk is heavy, but that the issues are so profoundly serious, and we face such a complex series of crises. But it's wonderful to have such a sane and incredibly enlightened perspective on it. Thank you very, very much for sharing your views with us this evening.
sit down.
I'm delighted to say there are some drinks in the foyer, so do please come and join us now for a drink. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was amazing. Absolutely brilliant.
Oh, was it?
Brilliant. Absolutely fantastic.
Oh, we're good.
There's so many more questions I have.
I'm so relieved because I wasn't sure. You know, you sat there